So this is Euclidean Time, which is a 3-track Euclidean pattern generator. For ZOIA and ZBoo, it outputs both CV and MIDI. The MIDI destinations can be set on this page called CV MIDI outputs. People, whenever I do a Euro Bureau patch, even if I say pretty quickly it does CV and MIDI, and most of the time they do, I get this question a lot. So I'm going to just go right to it. But I said it's 3 tracks. One is playing right now. We can add in the others. I worked quite a lot on the UI for this patch to try and make it something that was fast to program. So you may notice there are these 3 push buttons. When you select one, you select that track and the color of the UI changes up here. If you select it again, once it's already selected, it mutes that track, and we see the color that the steps are being played in goes from white to a highlighted color of that track, and they stop changing to white on the selected track down here. So I wanted, something that was kind of fast and convenient for muting tracks. We can change the number of steps on any track just by pressing the colored grid at the top that shows how many steps, up to 16. So we can also change the number of beats. And then if we press this button at the bottom called rotate, this bottom 2 rows doesn't select the number of beats anymore. It selects the degree of rotation for the pattern. So it changes where the 1 is as the beats are distributed through the Euclidean pattern generator. You can only move it up to 8 steps, but I figured in almost every application that covers the rotation you would want to do. There's no real reason to rotate like 15 steps because most of the patterns will sort of change their distribution accordingly across a 180 degree change. This may be easier to demonstrate if I put everything on the same number of beats. So, that's another feature. You can have, different step lengths for each track, which allows for these sort of evolving polyrhythmic things to occur. So if I change the rotation on this track, we hear a variation in the rhythm. And that's the main operation of the patch. Again, I spent a lot of time on the UI and trying to think of something that was a simple way to program something that can be kind of complex. So you just sort of pick the number of beats you want and the number of steps you want those beats distributed across, and it figures out the rest for you. On the second page, there are some additional controls on this page called options. We can change the gate length, which isn't really going to matter much for this. I'm triggering samples, so they're not really paying attention to gates. But if you have a situation, you know, maybe where you're controlling a synth voice, you can change the gate length up to 100% of a step. And any of these per track controls can be synced so that you can just use one parameter to control all of the tracks at once. And when that occurs, then the green track 1 control becomes the sort of master control. We have micro timing, which is kind of cool. You can sort of push things a little bit off the grid. Which adds more sort of organic feel to some rhythms. It only moves positively. You can only add micro timing, but the micro timing goes up to 100% of a step. So in a certain way, when you start getting up to 100%, you start getting kind of negative micro timing, where a beat arrives, or beat arrives ahead of the clock. So you can kind of use it in the same way you might use if you're used to the electron style where you can add micro timing positively or negatively. Here it works a little bit differently, but you can achieve similar effects. And then there is swing. I already have swing applied. Swing is applied to the clock, not the steps. So, if you have a pattern that only falls on like even beats, you might not even notice that there's a swing applied. So it's a little bit more subtle than in some other applications of swing. But I think that makes it, sound more organic. So we can apply positive or negative swing. Here I'm using the green control to apply it globally. And again, you can apply that on a per track basis and have positive or negative swing. And then there is a clock divider for each track, and there's also a built-in phase correction. So when you start adjusting clock dividers, they can get out of phase with the master clock, but you don't want the master clock resetting the phase all the time. If you have like a 2-3 clock division, because then it's going to reset everything on the 1 or on the quarter note, and you get sort of like not quite accurate times. But here what'll happen is, after a couple of beats, if it detects a difference between the previous tempo and the new tempo, it will send a reset message so that the master clock can be sent to reset the signal. So And that is the patch, just in terms of its operation. Uh, so, again, it can be used for CV or MIDI. It doesn't have to be used for rhythms in this sense. If you have like 3 sequencers, you can gate each of them by a different Euclidean rhythm and create some really interesting sort of melodic development that way. But, where you can use melodic elements to be triggered and create sort of little arpeggios that shift around. But this is, a Euclidean pattern generator. I did say that I was going to discuss some of the technical aspects of this when I was talking about the patch on ZOIA Discord. So I'm going to mute the patch right now. To do that, I might unmute some tracks, but it's sort of just easier for me to keep track of what's going on. I'm not going to go into sort of like super great detail and pick apart every aspect. You can download the patch to do that and, spend a little bit of time with it. Obviously, I'll be willing to answer questions, but it's just sort of, there's a cost benefit. So a couple of things just to discuss. We have the swing controls, and I've written about these on Tips and Tricks, so there's more information there. Basically, what you're doing is modulating the duty cycle of an LFO that's clocked by the master clock for that track, and then inverting it with a comparator. And what you do there is, as the duty cycle changes, the comparator will be moved off and on the grid. Use a flip-flop to divide that so that it only applies to every other step, and you get that swing shuffle feel. The phase sync that I talked about, where if you change the clock divider, the output goes back into sync with the master clock, is basically for a number of reasons and in different places, the clock is converted into CV in this patch using a tap to CV converter. And what happens here is I've got a series of flip-flops. There are 3 of them in series, so they create a divide by 8 output. And that's sampling the output of that tap to CV converter. And then we have comparators set up in an identity check configuration. I've written about this on Tips and Tricks. So basically, whenever the current output of the tap to CV converter and this sort of memory of the output of the tap to CV converter that is saved in this sample and hold that's clocked every 8 beats. When they disagree, the comparators, right now you see they're both high. One or the other will go low, and then once the tap to CV converter adjusts and you have agreement between the saved amount and the current amount, they'll both go high, and this sends a trigger to the reset input of the clock divider. And it only sends it that one time, so the next beat that the clock divider receives from the master clock will put it back on phase, but then it won't receive any other signals until the tempo changes again, which is, useful because it's really sort of annoying when clock dividers get out of phase. And so that's how you can sort of automatically put them back into phase. You can also just, if you're building your own patch, you can just, use a push button or whatever to send a trigger to that input. But so the way that the Euclidean pattern generator works, and part of the reason why we see the lights flashing on is because it doesn't generate the pattern ahead of time. It doesn't it's not given parameters and it goes, oh, it'll be this step and this step and this step that are part of the generator, or the pattern that's generated. It works by calculating those steps as it goes along, and it does this by counting up divisions. So we've got a sort of a step counter here. This is a sample and hold thing that I've gone over these in a few different places, and then we have and that's the step number is quantized with a steps module because we want to keep all the math really sort of as accurate as possible. So precision is key here. So we've got the steps output for that track quantized, and that goes into this multiplier. And then the other input of the multiplier is a division amount that comes from this sort of lookup table that I have. So whatever number of beats are applied to the steps, this will look up a different value for the division. And then basically what it does, so it takes sort of the master clock, and it counts up divisions of that as values, right? So if the sample and hold is always counting towards some limit that's set by the number of steps, let's say 1, and you wanted to have a Euclidean distribution of 3 steps across those 16 steps, which is what 1 represents in this, then you'd want the Euclidean generator to trigger every time it reached a new plateau of 0.333. So it's, at 0, at 0.33, at 0.66. And that's what this little multiplier is figuring out by multiplying the sort of total clock length or beat length by this division. It figures out where those points are that it's counting up to. And then on this page, there's what's called the division counter, and it's basically adding up the output of this sample and hold that's being used to count through all the steps and comparing it to those different thresholds. So when 1 is passed, the output of the division counter will go high, and then it'll sort of reset and start counting again. If we look at this, we have, these different points that are met and exceeded, and that's when it sort of jumps up again. So this is being added to every step, but this is only being added to when one of those thresholds is crossed. And then there's a bunch of other stuff thrown in there to make it work right. I'm not sure I could explain it if I spent a lot of time with it, but it's mostly me fiddling with, I know what this needs to do, and then sussing out the logic, but not by writing it out and being conscientious about it, just sort of swearing and trying stuff until it clicked, because my brain wasn't figuring out what needed to happen to have it occur in the way that I expected. And then the rotation stuff, and this is also where the micro timing is handled, is pretty simple. Again, we have the clock converted into CV, and we have a CV delay. The clock is multiplied by just passing it through different value modules, and the position, the rotation just changes the delay that's applied to that particular track. The micro timing is, you know, uh, scaled against the output of the tap to CV converter for an entire step, and then that's how that is set up. So that's pretty much the sort of like generation, and then there's just like a butt ton of UI stuff that I added because I wanted something. UI design is a challenge, and it's an interesting one for me. So like trying to figure out how to utilize space and create something that's sort of logical and hopefully intuitive. I don't always succeed there, but I like playing with it. So if you wanted to do a pattern generator of your own using these principles, you could save a lot of CPU. We're right up against it here. If you look at the CPU limit, it's hovering just around 100. It's fine. I've gone through and it's fine, but it's right up there at the edge. So if you wanted to build something like this on your own, um, you could certainly do 4 tracks if you wanted to have a different UI approach. If you were doing it over MIDI, um, you could have more than 4 tracks. I just mentioned 4 because of the sort of CV limit here. You could probably throw in some simple but not super simple like drum voices and have something internal if you wanted to build a pattern generator with this approach. But I wanted to mess around with UI, and I hope the UI is appreciated because it took a long time and it required a lot of forethought, which I'm not very good at, to get it to this point. Um, but yeah, that's Euclidean time. So I hope you check out the patch. I hope you enjoy it. If you use it in something, please tag me. You can find my tags on my patch storage profile. I'm at CHMJakes or CHMJakes in a lot of cases. I'm not on Twitter anymore, um, but I am on Instagram and Reddit and other places, YouTube. So, uh, yeah, if you try something out, tag me, maybe like this patch. I'm going to unmute things again and play around a little bit, just changing some patterns around. Uh, but yeah, have fun.